I love Slitterhead. I love it despite the fact that there's a lot about Slitterhead I don't like very much. A little like that lad you went to school with that you barely liked then, and like even less now in adulthood, Slitterhead is crass and seedy and pretty gross. Your other half keeps asking you why you don't just ghost him if he's that bad, but the truth is, you're kinda crass and seedy and pretty gross too. He just brings it out in you, the same as Bokeh Game Studios apparently brings this out in me. Cards on the table, right? I did not expect this. An hour in, I'm having a nightmare. And I'm not just talking about the twisted forms of Slitterhead's eponymous enemies. Tutorials are popping up every 15 seconds, and my old enough to have a kid graduating university fingers just can't adapt to the chaos on screen. I'm struggling to not just button mash as furiously as the game demands, but also to understand why. There are too many button prompts, and I am tired of scanning tiny tutorial text in a desperate and usually failed attempt to stay alive. Perhaps unsurprisingly then, I initially bounced off Slitterhead hard, frustrated by the systems and overwhelmed by the combat, which is a problem, I admit, when you're playing an action horror game. If I'd been playing this on my own time, I reckon I probably would have put the controller down a couple of hours in and called it a day, not because it's bad, but because I felt like I was. I was desperate to explore more and uncover the mystery, but couldn't because I was stopped every 10 minutes by a mini boss fight that overwhelmed me in seconds. Slitterhead takes place in the underbelly of a 90s neon-soaked Kowloon, a dark, dirty and sleazy place so beautiful that I endlessly abuse my screenshot button. It's a delight to explore, which is just as well as, courtesy of a time loop-esque element that I'm simply not going to mention again so as not to spoil anything, you'll find yourself revisiting some backdrops quite often. Hioki, the incorporeal spirit we embody, or not as the case may be, has no memory or past, but is hell-bent on finding and destroying every one of the bizarre Slitterheads masquerading as Kowloon's population. With no physical form though, Hioki's pretty much useless. Instead, they move through the city by invading people like a psychic parasite. They can't travel far without a host, so once you've maneuvered your current human as far as they can go, you'll need to swap to another consciousness. Young, old, short, tall, fat, thin, it doesn't matter. All can be mentally seized by you and forced to do your bidding. Their very blood fashioned into weapons. Clubs, poles, claws, blades, shotguns, you name it, as you track down the bizarre monsters they call Slitterheads. A word I actually, oddly, can't say out loud without feeling like I've sworn. Hioki may rely on humans, but they have no regard for them. Using and abusing bodies with reckless abandon, they're happy to sacrifice a human's frail blood and bones if it means getting closer to their objective, darting from person to person as they brawl, recycling Kowloon's poor inhabitants as unwitting collateral. Don't expect to play favourites though, you can't. Stick with or in one soul for too long and you're dead. Hioki is essentially rewarded for moving swiftly between hosts, as every time you shift possession, you'll briefly unlock enhanced abilities and max blood level. Every now and then, however, Hioki happens upon a human that isn't quite, well, normal. Dubbed rarities, they can not only sense when Hioki infiltrates them, but they're also infused with special abilities that Hioki can use in battle. Again, this took me a bloody age to acclimate to, not least because using abilities comes at the cost of your human's blood power, and until you learn to replenish it by sucking up the blood of the fallen, it'll always feel like you're seconds away from death. Happily, rarities are more permanent kinds of companions than your human cannon fodder. You can bring up to 2 of them with you on missions, and each has their own set of bespoke abilities to upgrade via their respective skill trees. Once I'd found one to suit my playstyle, that was when Slitterhead finally started to click for me, though I must admit they weren't without their own annoyances. They accompany you as physical entities in the world, for example, and they frequently got left behind as I hopped between humans, especially if one was on the other side of a locked gate, say. In battle, they're not available straight away either, so if you start fighting as a bog standard human, you need to hold out for a while before your rarity finally decides to pitch in. They're certainly not the most intuitive companions I've ever dealt with then, and it did take a beat to internalise all this and get used to the rhythms of how they worked. Eventually though, once I'd unlocked some more abilities and different skills, not to mention more rarities, I realised I wasn't enduring these fights anymore as much as I was enjoying them. I'll admit that sometimes it all feels a little inelegant, and occasionally the controls feel clunky and unrefined, particularly around platforming, but only rarely did they get in my way or verge toward frustration. Although combat sequences where you have to tackle a legion of idiot humans and their laser rifles, as well as slitterheads, are still a special blend of maddening. Zooming from soul to soul as you flick poison darts from here, a bloody gunshot blast from there, never stopping in a body long enough for the slitter to decipher which host you're using, it's all devilishly good fun, especially as you mix up close and far-ranged weapons. Block, evade, fight, and deflect. Parry, in other words, at the right times, and you'll be able to pull off even more special moves, such as the Slitterhead's bullet time ability, Blood Time. In theory, anyway. Again, I don't have the reflexes for this kind of stuff, and my dearth of successful deflex proves it. That said, it's what Slitterhead does outside of the combat that I love best. As you learn more about Slitterheads, you'll realise their motivations may not be quite what they seem. The mystery of how Hioki came to be and why these dreadful creatures are here is an enticing one, and how you piece things together, scouting for clues, eavesdropping on conversations, creeping through no-go areas. It's great, that stuff. Sometimes Hioki has to find the right person to possess to slip through the crowds unnoticed. Other times it needs to utilise a blood jump power that lets mere mortals sail across rooftops and neon lights in search of slitters. In one particularly memorable sequence, Hioki leaps from consciousness to consciousness, trying to bust out of prison. Traversal becomes its own kind of environmental puzzle in these situations, and it's here where Slitterhead shines the brightest, and I wish there were more of them. Interestingly, the story itself mostly plays out in stylized intermission conversations through which Hioki learns to better understand humanity and the rarities they inhabit. There's very little spoken word. Most, if not quite all, is conveyed via grunts and sighs on top of subtitles. But the more you talk to your rarities, the more clues you uncover, which in turn unlocks hidden missions. The rub comes in how those hidden missions are presented, as your progress can stall if you don't keep on top of them. Many involve returning to previously completed missions, for example, and scouring them afresh for new paths leading to hitherto unknown characters you have to find to get further into the game. Other times you may need to scratch around for a missing clue. Slitterhead isn't particularly forthcoming in explaining all of this, and some may find it rather grating. For me though, I relished going back to these levels and spending more time poking through Kowloon streets. As it stands, there's not much incentive for stepping off the beaten path here, and Slitterhead always felt more alive for me when I could put my sleuthing hat on as opposed to splattering enemies with blood bullets. Slitterhead's macabre presentation and salacious storytelling may not suit all tastes. For a brief while there, I was pretty certain it didn't suit mine, and if you prefer your horror a tad less frenetic and a little more cerebral, I posit this may not be the game for you. However, from the moment you boot it up and realise that the dissonant human scatting and squeaking you hear is music, you'll know Slitterhead is something different, something weird. It's campy and schlocky and violent and gross, and I can confirm that yes, its content warnings of scenes of sexual acts, nudity, violence, murder, suicide, depictions of blood, criminal activity, and the consumption of alcohol and cigarettes are all there in spades. So it's probably not one to play in front of your kids. Or your mum. Or anyone with a phobia of blood, although it does sound like your average evening in Dundee. But at the same time, Slitterhead is stylish and thrilling and unusual, and really, how can you say no when there's one particular Slitterhead that looks uncannily like Beetlejuice? How lucky we are that something as singular and unapologetically strange as this exists.